What's up, guys? This is a session from a couple weeks ago at Elite, formerly 101 Poker in Houston. It's a relatively short session, but I hope that you enjoy. I wanted to give a shout out to Max Rocks, who hosts the game. I think he runs the best game in Houston, so anyone that's trying to play 5-5 or 5-10 should check it out. We run 5-10 every Monday and 5-5 every Thursday. We get about 3 tables each time. And starting next week, we're going to be running an additional game on Tuesday. I also believe that they're trying to start a stream in the near future, so that should be a lot of fun. So if you're in town, come join us. We'd be happy to play with you. This is the first hand we are dealt on the session, and it ends up being a pretty sizable pot. We have a tighter older gentleman open up the hijack to $20, and I have a pretty clear 3-bet with pocket jacks on the button. I bump it up to 70, and the small blind player elects to 4-bet to $250. I think that this player definitely likes to see flops, although I expect most of their 4-bet range to be pretty nutted here, as I would expect a lot of their middling hands to be just flatting to my 3-bet. I think when he 4-bets here, he has a lot of overpairs and hands like ace-king, ace-queen. I think there's probably a very small frequency of things like pocket 10s that I'm possibly ahead of, as well as something like ace-jack, ace-10. Although I think that he's 4-betting those at a very low frequency if he is. Regardless, I think that we have a pretty pure continue here. With pocket jacks, our hand is just too strong to fold. The older gentleman folds and we make the call. We go to the flop with the pot at $525, and the flop is the lovely 8 of clubs, jack of hearts, 5 of diamonds, giving us top set. If we were behind pre-flop, we definitely are not now, and we're going to try to get all the money in. My opponent elects to check here, and I think that I can use a multitude of sizes here. I think both small and larger sizes are fine. My specific combo is generally going to lean towards using smaller sizes, as you block a lot of continues with top set. I think that I don't really have to use too many large sizes here in general, as even though we are pretty deep in a 4-bet pot, the SPR is so much lower that I think we can get the money in relatively easily. I elect to continue here for a bet of 40% pot and bet $200. I expect my opponent to mostly have hands like ace-king, ace-queen that check here on the flop that have to still continue. At least if they have backdoors, they might continue regardless on the flop. And my opponent should be checking some of his overpairs here, so aces, kings, queens. And then I think it's possible if he did have something like 10s or 9s that he would be checking here as well. He makes the call, and we go to the turn with the pot at $925. The turn is the 9 of clubs. It's an interesting turn card, as there are a lot of draws that come into play at this point. I think that I generally want to be using a larger size on this turn. One, because I think that my range is much more favored on this turn card. I have a lot more sets than my opponent and some straights. But I think that generally I want to be using large sizes here, as there's a lot of rivers that kill my action. If I river like a queen or a 10 or a 7, bring 4 to a straight, a club can bring in the flush draw. So it's not so much that I'm behind, I just want to make sure that we get all the money in by the river. I do think that my opponent could have picked up some equity here if they did have a hand like pocket 10s, or they did decide to float with a hand like ace 10 or king 10, even though I think those specific combos are unlikely. My opponent also could have picked up a set of 9s here, but mostly I expect him to have overpairs and hands like ace king, ace queen of clubs that continue here. He checks and I go for the large sizing and I bet $650. He thinks for a little bit and he makes the call. And we go to the river with the pot at $2,225. The river is unfortunately the 10 of hearts. Any queen is a straight here, which is very unfortunate. I'm now behind hands like ace queen and pocket queens. I would expect those hands to play differently. I would expect queens to generally be betting the flop, and I'm not sure if my opponent is continuing with ace queen without a backdoor flush draw, in addition to calling a turn bet, but it's definitely possible. Regardless, I think that we still do have a value bet here. I think that my opponent still has some pocket aces, some pocket kings, and if they have a hand like pocket 10s, pocket 9s, I don't think they can fold here either. And this is half the reason that we bet pretty large on the turn, to set up a pretty easy river shove. My opponent checks and I go all in for the remaining 900. He reluctantly calls, I show the pocket jacks, and he shows pocket aces. So we got pretty lucky on this first hand of the session. Definitely a good start. The next interesting hand of the session, we open up King 10 of spades from early position to $40 over a straddle. We see a flat from the player that had aces in the last hand, and we see a 3-bet squeeze from the player in the hijack to $200. This player is very aggressive. I think that they're definitely over bluffing, and they often use very large sizes. I think that my specific hand here wants to mix fold, but I think versus a wide range, it's probably fine to call here. I just really have to be willing to call down on some pretty marginal runouts. I do make the call, and the loose player makes the fold, and we go to the flop with the pot at $440. The flop is the 4 of spades, 6 of clubs, jack of spades. So we flop the second nut flush with the backdoor straight and an overcard. We check, and he bets $175. And I think that we have a pretty clear continue here. Generally going to be calling here with 2 of the larger spades. I definitely can mix raise here at a lower frequency though. I make the call, and we go to the turn with the pot at $790. The turn is the king of hearts. I check, and my opponent barrels here for about half pot, $425. I think that my hand can definitely continue here as a call or a raise. I think on this specific turn card, we're often ahead of our opponent when he's very aggressively betting. I think that my opponent's going to be barreling all of his ace-queen, ace-10 combos, some of his smaller suited ace-x combos. I think that my opponent can still value bet here for half pot with a hand like ace-jack as well. Because realistically, I don't have too many king x combos. It's really only king of spades and possibly something like the king queen of clubs. And generally, I think that my opponent is also going to be just barreling this card at a high frequency because he has a lot more of the ace king combos. I think against this specific opponent with his wide range that my king 10 suited here is definitely on the higher end of value. Obviously, we have the flush draw with additional equity, but I think that my pair of kings is often ahead. I elect to raise to $1,250. He thinks for a little bit, and he reluctantly folds, and we scoop the second pot of the night. Unfortunately, I think I play this hand pretty poorly, and I take a suboptimal line, but we'll see what you guys think. We have a $10 straddle. It folds around to me in the small blind, and I open up Jack 7 of hearts to $40. The straddle elects to call here. This is the same opponent that we faced last hand. I think that this player is going to be 3-betting a very high frequency here. And I think that in position here, they're going to have a relatively wide range. We go to the flop, which is the 5 of clubs, jack of clubs, 7 of spades, giving me top 2 pair. Blind versus blind, the majority of flops, I'm just going to be playing a range check. And if I want to play my hand aggressively, I'm going to be playing it as a check raise. This is one of those flops, so I elect to check, and my opponent decides to bet on the larger side, betting $60 into $85, and I do decide to check raise it up to $240. I think that this specific board, I'm going to have a very high frequency of check raises. There's a ton of draws here, both flush draws and straight draws, and I think that a lot of my strong top pairs, my 2 pairs, and sets can all bet here as well. I don't expect my opponent to have a better hand than me almost ever here. He possibly has a hand like pocket 5s, but I think pocket jacks and probably pocket 7s are both going to be pure 3-bets by him pre-flop. So I'm very surprised when he bumps it up to $785. At this point, my opponent likely has a combo draw, something like 8-6 of clubs, 10-9 of clubs. I think he could be doing this with a top pair combo like ace-jack or king-jack, although I would expect him for the most part to be 3-betting those hands pre. It's also possible that he has a hand like 7x of clubs, and if he is 3-betting here with a hand like jack 5 or 7-5, we have him crushed. I think my hand can probably continue as a re-raise or a call. I think in hindsight, I probably want to be playing my hand is mostly a pure call against this specific opponent, as they're definitely getting out of line and raising way too often, including raising here probably with some junky hands. And I think I generally want to play my hand as a call down on a lot of runouts and just let him blast off and bluff away. Obviously, we're going to have to evaluate if some of the scarier cards come out on the turn or river. In this instance, I decide to shove all in for 3,175 effective. The other problem with my raise here is I think it's a little bit on the large size. I think if he has a combo draw, he still probably has to call here. And I think he's probably still calling with 2 pair, but I think I definitely push out a lot of hands that I could have got value from later. In the moment, I did slightly misread and thought I was shoving for slightly less, but I think regardless, my shove is pretty large and I would have liked to play my hand as a call. He thinks for a little bit and he ultimately does decide to make the fold, which is fine. We probably folded out a lot of equity and we still scoop a pretty large pot without having to get to showdown. In this hand, we have a early position open to $40 from a solid reg. A weaker player makes the call, and I once again look down at pocket jacks, this time in the big blind. I bump it up to $180. I think I could probably make it slightly larger, but I think my sizing is fine here. The loose player in the straddle decides to cold call the 3-bet. The reg continues and the weaker player folds, and we go multi-way to a flop of 10 of clubs, 3 of clubs, 2 of hearts. I think generally this is going to be a board that I'm using larger sizes on. I can definitely size down when we are multi-way, but I think that all pocket pairs are probably going to have to continue here, as well as flush draws and 10x. The hands that are going to be folding are often going to be hands that do have equity against us, so hands like king, queen, which is another reason why our hand wants to bet, as it gets denial in addition to value. I do elect to go a larger size here, and I bet $320. The player in the straddle thinks for a little bit, and he makes the call, and the reg quickly folds. I think when the looser player makes the call here, they have, like I said, all of the pocket pairs. I think he's going to have some ace-5, ace-4 style of hands, in addition to possibly having a pair on the board or a flush draw. We go to the turn with the pot at $1,225, and the turn is the 4 of diamonds. I think this is a pretty interesting turn card, as it doesn't really improve my opponent's value range, but they can definitely pick up a lot of draw equity here. If they had a hand like ace-10 or the ace-high flush draw, they now have a straight draw. If they have a hand like pocket 6s, pocket 5s, they've also picked up a straight draw. It's also a card that rarely improves any of my hands, so I think that if my opponent does have a value hand like pocket 9s or 10x, they have to pretty much pure continue here. Overall, I think I probably want to be using a larger sizing here, as our hand can still gain a lot of value, but denial is still a part of this. Overall, I think I want to be using a larger sizing here. There's a ton of hands to gain value from, and I think that we still get a little bit of denial. I think that this player is going to be calling all of their 10x here, so I think that a larger bet makes a lot of sense. I continue here for a bet of $725. My opponent thinks for a little bit, and he makes the call. We now go to a river with the pot at $2,675. The river is the 2 of diamonds. Not my favorite river to see, as my opponent can definitely have some ace-x combos. I think it's mostly going to be the ace of clubs or ace-10, although I think that they would continue the flop with their wheel aces as well. Overall, I think that my opponent is much more weighted towards 10x hands and hands like pocket 9s through pocket 6s. So I decided to go for thin value here and bet 1,800. I think I probably could have gone slightly smaller, as it's really hard for those hands to call a bet. Generally, I do like to go pretty polarized in these spots where I do have draws that miss though. My opponent reluctantly folds after tanking for a little while. I show the pocket jacks, showing him that he's made a good fold. He's a very nice guy, and we scoop this sizable pot. This was the hand of the night, so let's see how it plays out. We have a early position raise from the very aggressive player to $40. A reg in the low jack makes the call, and it folds around to me in the big blind. I look down at ace of spades, king of spades. I 3-bet to $200. I think I could probably make this slightly larger as well, but I think I'm very ahead of both my opponent's ranges at this point. The aggressive player elects to make the call, and the reg makes the fold. We go to a flop with the pot at $450. The flop is the 2 of diamonds, 9 of spades, 9 of diamonds. I think that my hand can be played as either a bet or a check on this board. Generally, if I'm playing it as a bet, it's going to be using a large sizing. I expect to still get value from a lot of weaker ace-high hands and some flush draws, as well as some backdoor flush draws, and I have a lot of equity versus my opponent's pairs. I think that versus this specific opponent, when we are this deep, I'm going to elect to check here with the intention of calling. I think, again, I'm ahead of all of my opponent's bluffs here, especially when they have a very wide range, and we can still improve with our overcards. I would also be checking here with some of my stronger pocket pairs, things like aces, kings, and queens at some frequency, more often with a diamond. I check, and he decides to check back. I think that this opponent is generally going to be betting a lot of their air here. I think that their flush draws definitely bet a very high frequency, and I would expect most of their 9x combos to also be betting here. I could see him playing his pocket pairs, especially weaker ones, either way, although I would assume that most of them are going to be betting for denial at a high frequency, but I think it's fine for him to check back as well. The turn is the ace of diamonds, giving me top pair, top kicker. At this point, I definitely think that I can bet here, but it's not necessary. Generally, the third diamond is going to be better for the 3-bet caller, as they have more of the suited hands, while I have more of the stronger pocket pairs and the ace-king, ace-queen offsuit. Because my opponent likes to bluff so frequently, I think that I want to be playing my hand as a check call here, a pretty high frequency, and essentially just catching all of his bluffs. I check here, and he goes very large, betting $400 into $450. I think we have a pretty clear continue here. He's definitely betting worse value hands, like ace-queen through ace-10, and possibly any of the weaker suited ace-x that he has in his range, although I'm not sure that they would be using this sizing. And we're still ahead of a lot of his bluffs. I think he still has a lot of air here. I think he's going to have a lot of pairs with a single diamond here, and he might be continuing pre-flop with hands like king, queen, queen, jack offsuit, although I'm not very positive. We go to the river with the pot at $1,250. The river is the king of diamonds. Very interesting river card overall. Generally, this fourth diamond is going to be much better for the 3-betters range, as I do have hands like pocket queens and ace queen here with a diamond, while my opponent has very few of those combos. It's obviously slightly better for me if the fourth diamond is a slightly lower card, but I also have a pretty strong nut advantage here as I play a high frequency of my pocket aces and pocket kings this way. Although I think a lot of my pocket kings combos are probably forced to fold the turn without the diamond versus the very large sizing, but I think versus this opponent I probably do have more pocket kings than normal. At this point, I'm hoping to check and hoping that my opponent checks back and we win at showdown. We're still going to lose to some weaker diamond flushes by him when he checks back, but I do think that we take it down versus a couple of pocket pairs that he decided to bet the turn for denial and his weaker ace-x combos. Unfortunately, when we check, he goes big again, betting $1,100 into this pot and putting us in a pretty tough spot. I think about it for a while, and after consideration, I realize that it's very hard for my opponent to have a nutted hand here, and it's very, very hard for him to call, especially with my specific combo that is blocking aces and kings. Although my opponent really doesn't have these combos, I'm also blocking none of his bluffs, and like I said, I would play a hand like aces or kings this way, and I also have all of the stronger flush draw combos that my opponent doesn't have as well, and I'm also blocking a lot of the stronger queen x flush combos that my opponent doesn't have as well. So I think that this hand specifically makes a pretty interesting raise candidate, and I decide to check raise to 2,500. Not a very large size by me, but I think that when I'm check raising here on the river, I'm extremely polarized, and it's a spot where I'm very often nutted and it's very hard for my opponent to continue. Even if my opponent has a hand like the queen of diamonds flush, it's very hard for him to make the call because what am I raising here? I'm not going to be really raising any worse flush draws, so I find it hard to believe that he thinks I'm raising something like a jack or a 10 high flush on a 4 flush paired board. And often my opponent has a weaker flush than that, so I think I can apply a lot of pressure. He tanks for a couple minutes, and ultimately he does make the fold, and we get this check raise bluff through. There's always a chance that I was ahead with my ace king with the top 2 pair here, but I think that my opponent is fully capable of turning weaker pairs with a diamond into a bluff here on the river as well. And I think that there's a lot more expected value gained from my hand as a raise here as opposed to a call. Pretty short session overall, very profitable. I ran extremely well for the most part. Helps when you flop top set versus aces on the first hand that you're dealt in. I was able to build it up from there, and then I had the massive bluff at the end with ace king. Overall, I was able to build my stack up to about 9K, bought in for 2K, so I made about 7K in profit this session. As always, I appreciate you guys tuning in. Please like and subscribe, and I'll keep pushing out content. Thanks.